Hey everyone, welcome back. So we are going to go over a few more advanced patterns for front-end pluggability this afternoon, and starting with creating a slot. So starting with the opposite side of the plugin equation, and then we'll look at some more advanced patterns that you can use for plugins themselves in the slot.
Was anybody not here before? Okay, one. You got the IP, right? Did you get an IP address? Yeah. Oh, you have some there.
So as a quick overview of the plugin system, step one is creating a plugin slot. You only need this if there isn't a slot already that exists. So this is what we'll talk about today. And then when you create a slot, you can decide if there's default content that you want to leave in the slot or not. So that's the second step of creating a slot. And then the third step is customizing it by putting plugins in. This is all very straightforward if you saw the earlier part. You will need an environment to follow along for this. So if you did the beginner workshop, you should already be good to go. But if you weren't here for the beginner part, then here's the address, which should also be on the whiteboard, and you can follow the instructions to get your VM set up.
On the whiteboard, there's a different link, but it's to this roughly the same place, just easier to type.
So we're going to look at the learning MFE and adding an example plugin slot to the learning MFE. And this is what our goal will be. So in the learning MFE, you'll see this page when you're actually in a course viewing some content. We're going to wrap the actual content of the course in a plugin slot so that you can, what you see in yellow will be the default content, so that's the course content of the unit. And then the blue bar at the top is sort of a prefix to the unit where you can insert plugins. And then the coral red color bar at the bottom is the end of the unit where you can also insert sort of a footer for that unit. So this will be our goal for the first part of the advanced session. I should also mention that if you go to that link and you have the GitHub repo open, at the bottom of the GitHub repo, you'll see a link to the slides here. And so if you want to follow along or even work ahead or catch up from where I am on the slides, use the link there. You can open these same slides on Google Docs. And you can also copy code out of the slides if you want to. So feel free to use those slides on your own computer to work ahead or catch up as needed. So this is our goal for today, to turn this unit page into a slot that we can put plugins in, and then we'll create a few plugins that go in there. Normally this would be step one. If you're here for the beginning part, you don't have to do most of this. The only thing you have to do is the very last step, tutor dev do import demo course. And this will create the demo course for you. You can use your own course if you prefer. Feel free to just create a course in Studio. We just need 1 or 2 units and 1 or 2 components in each one, but this is much easier. So
if you are running that, there's currently a bug in development mode where the course outline's not generated. So you either need to go into Studio and republish the course, or run another command if you want to show it. Braden is in that README.
Where is that?
Find the import demo course there. Yeah, there it is.
Okay. So if you have the GitHub repo open, you can get that.
You might run into this in like your own life, so be aware that that's what's happening. If you import a course in development mode, and if it breaks when you try to go into it, you need to regenerate the outline.
So please go ahead and do that now, and if you have any trouble getting a course imported, just raise your hand and Adolfo or Felipe can help you out.
Same place. Yeah, same place.
So next we're going to create a plugin slot. And the easiest way to do this is, as always in development, just copy someone else's code. So here are the commands you can run right now. I should mention that you need to do this from the Frontend App Learning folder. So be aware that there's Frontend App Learner Dashboard, which we were using last time. That's not the one we're using for this MFE. It's Frontend App Learning. And from that folder, you can run these commands. You'll see that there is already this folder called plugin slots, which we saw briefly in the beginner session, where you can list all the existing plugin slots. So we'll create a new directory for our new plugin and call it unit contents slot. And you'll see there's already a unit title slot, so we can just copy unit title slot and rename it to unit content slot. And now we have our new slot definition. So just run those 3 commands basically, and you will get the new slot. And then here we're going to define the details of the new slot. So just open that file in your favorite editor. You can use Nano or you can use VS Code or Emacs or whatever you'd like. The main thing, because we copied this, most of the code will already be there, so you don't have to change too much. Just look for where it says unit title slot and change it to unit contents slot. The important parts here are kind of bolded. The prop types at the bottom are not necessary at all. If it were me, I would just delete them, but you can leave them in if you like prop types validation. And otherwise, just copy this code here. So the main things you need to change are the name of the variable from content slot, or from title slot to content slot. And then in the actual plugin slot component, there's an ID. This is the most important part right here, where you give the ID of the slot. So we're going to give it an ID unit content slot.
That's a pattern we're trying to establish officially. Snake case with underscore slot at the end.
And the other thing this is doing, I don't know how familiar everyone is with React, but basically this unit content slot is getting 3 properties passed to it: the course ID, the unit ID, and the children. So as you'll see, the children will contain the actual contents of the unit, so we're not going to modify that here. But all we do with the plugin slot is we pass course ID and unit ID as properties, so those will be available to any plugins in this slot. This is how we sort of define the API contract for the plugin. So this tells us that each plugin will get the course ID and the unit ID. They're both strings. And then here in the contents of the plugin slot React component, we're putting the children. And so that's going to be the default contents. And in this case, it's going to be just the actual contents of the unit.
Okay.
So this is how we define the new slot. If you have the slides open, this is actually an image, so you can't copy the code as easily off of this slide. But back on the GitHub repo, there's a link to a pull request that has all the code from this session. So you can click on that link, and then you can access any code that you need. Anything you see on my screen today will be in that pull request, so you can copy it out if you want to.
If you need help with that, just raise your hand with anything. So in the last session, I think it was Hajis raised the concern where you can theoretically, from inside this unit content slot component, import or actually use anything from the MFE. Like use the entire MFE as an API, right? We don't want plugin developers to do that. And the way we provide for that is via the props that you pass down, right? So as a developer of a slot, you need to think really hard about which properties you want to make available to plugins. Like, it doesn't mean they'll have to use them, but that they can use them. And it also means that you're supporting that API, not forever, but for hopefully a sufficient amount of time that doesn't make it difficult for people to upgrade from one release to the other, in most cases, right? It's not a promise that this won't change, but it's the intention that to make upgrading easier for people. Right?
So in this case, I think if you're creating a plugin that's part of the unit contents, it makes sense to have the course ID and the unit ID. Anything else is probably too much for this type of plugin. You could pass in, I don't know, the learner's grade in the course or something like that. But if something like that is necessary, as we'll see, it's better for the plugin to get it from an API than to depend on the MFE passing more data in. So in this case, we're keeping it really simple. All that the plugin knows about is the course ID, the unit ID, and then it actually gets the, as we'll see, it can modify the content itself as well later if it wants to. So this is how you create a new slot. And to be clear, this requires forking the MFE, modifying the code, and then at the end of this process, ideally you would open a pull request and we'd have a discussion about, is this a good slot? Are these the right props to pass in to plugins that are in this slot? What's your use case? Can we see an example of what type of plugins you want to put in this slot? That sort of thing. And then this would be merged into the MFE, and future people won't have to do this step at all. The slot will be there, it'll be documented, and can just start using it.
By the way, if you have a real case that you want a slot for now, feel free to use the time to actually create one in a PR that might make it into Sumac, right? So it would actually be awesome if some of you did that. Oh, on Friday. So on Friday we have, what's it called, office hours? OpenX office hours, where we can discuss all this too.
And again, if I'm going too fast or too slow, just use the slides link that I sent you. That's linked to from the repo. And then the last step for making the slot work, so we defined it in that file, but it's not getting referenced anywhere. So you have to find the actual place in the MFE UI where that thing appears that you want to turn into a plugin. And in the case of the learning MFE, this path that you see on the screen, source, courseware, course, sequence, unit, index.jsx, that's where you'll find the code that actually displays a unit in the learning MFE. And we don't have to make too many changes here. Just at the beginning on line 18, you need to import that new unit content slot that we created. And then look for this content iframe element on line 55, and you just have to wrap that with our new unit content slot. So just add this unit content slot React element here, and we pass in those props that we defined as the new API. So we pass in course ID, we pass in unit ID. Here in this page, it's just called ID, so we're renaming it to unit ID for the plugin. And then this content iframe, just leave it unchanged. You don't have to change the code, you just have to indent it by one more tab as we wrap it with our plugin slot. So that's making this content iframe becomes the children that we saw in the previous code, and that's getting passed in to become the default contents of the slot. So that's how you modify the existing UI. And if it works properly, no news is good news. So try to refresh the MFE, and you should see that it looks exactly the same. But now it's slotified so that we can put plugins into it. Any questions about that so far?
You all understand the concept of the default contents with the keep default flag that you can, when you create a plugin, you can choose to keep them or not. Right? So in mconfig.js, you get control over whether the default content is shown or not, right? It's not up to the MFE developer to make that decision for the user in the end, right?
Yeah.
In this case, the children is the iframe actually, right?
So in this case, the children is the iframe, and probably there's like a div that wraps the iframe, and then everything inside.
And everything inside the
Yeah,
iframe.
and that contains all the contents of the unit.
And I wonder if you can access things from inside the iframe.
So, yeah,
because
so-
of course, and that issues.
So right now, the learning MFE, it renders the actual content in an iframe, and every component from the unit is in that one iframe. For our purposes, we can't wrap those components in slots or do anything inside the unit because it's all just one big iframe, and it's sort of opaque to the MFE. In the future, we're talking about how to resolve this situation. We want to get rid of the iframe or find a more performant way to include the unit contents. So for now, just consider that too unstable to work with plugins for anything smaller than the unit level. All we can do is we have this iframe. We can put stuff in front of it and at the end of it, and we can, as you'll see, we can also modify the whole thing, but we can't access inside the iframe.
Yeah.
Don't confuse this. Don't confuse this iframe with the iframe plugin type. This is the iframe
That's true.
that gets drawn around the whole unit in the MFE, right? Just making sure people.
And I will say, if you did want to put something, after each component or something, there is the XBlocks aside API and other stuff like that, which you can do. Can I see a show of hands if anyone has got to this step where you've made it into a slot and it still looks the same? Or do you need a bit more time? Okay, one person? Two people? All right.
Again, if you need any help, we're here.
Yeah.
It's a workshop, so feel free to ask.
So I'll wait a few more minutes before we move on then.
I still don't understand this default content thing. What is default content in the context of an MFE?
It's the children of the slot itself in the MFE as they're defined in the MFE. So you have the slot component, something slot, right? Unit content slot. Whatever goes inside that is the default content.
So what you're saying is that keep default means append to the list of children?
Yeah, when you use insert, yes.
Or or
prepend.
Prepend or append, and keep default equals false means replace.
Replace, yeah. In effect, yes. If, again, this is V0 of this API, I'm sure you can...
That was not a loaded question.
But here you can see everything in color is the slot that we've defined now. The thing in yellow is the default contents of the slot. Can I see who's still working to get to this point? Okay. Don't be shy if you have questions or need help.
How many of you fork MFEs? No. How many MFEs do you fork? All of them? Almost all of them? Okay. I'll be interested in hearing later or whenever about why do you fork, like which parts do you customize? So we can think about adding slots for those parts, right? Oh, okay, so you just... You also got that? Yeah, make sure when you copy the slot definition that you also update the export name. Yeah. If you don't, you're going to run into unit title slot is not defined error. If you, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that when I was calling out the places to change in this file. The very last line, almost hidden at the bottom of the screen, is since we renamed the variable on line 4, we have to rename the export as well.
For what? Oh yeah, just go to that README. Do you have it open? Bit.ly pluggability.
Oh, is that a question from Braden? Yes. Self, can we use TypeScript when we're making these plugins? Oh, that's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked that. So the answer is for Redwood, you cannot use TypeScript, at least not easily. Frontend build 13, which we're using in Redwood, is not really set up for TypeScript. It will kind of work in development mode, so if you want to hack around with that today, you might find that it works, but if you build for production or run tests, it won't work. We already have Frontend build 14, and some MFEs are already upgraded to it post Redwood, so you can use Redwood. You can use TypeScript in the future. The reason I mentioned that is it would catch this error right away, and it would show in VS Code that, you know, if you rename the variable, then you'd have to rename the export. So basically, if you're targeting Redwood, don't worry about TypeScript. It's probably more work than it's worth to get it working. And for example, the front-end plugin framework doesn't have types, So right now, you have to kind of awkwardly switch back and forth between the documentation and your editor as you write this config file. I find that very annoying, so in the future, I'm going to make sure Frontend Plugin Framework is fully typed, and then VS Code will auto-complete the config for you as you go, and it will be much easier to get this on config.jsx file correct.
What we managed to do is it works for some cases. That instead of forking, we created a git patch, and then we applied the patch just
Sorry, I didn't know. Oh, yeah.
we created a git patch, and we applied that patch just before.
Oh, I remember. Yep. It's almost.
Yeah, but that works only in limited cases.
Yeah.
Unless it won't work in a component.
Yep. With something like this, it would.
Something's not looking right. I thought it was there.
The command run successful. The import demo course work.
Run. We're catching an error somewhere in the build.
The MFE build or the.
The MFE.
Oh, okay.
Now it's being obscured
Yeah,
by
let me try. Oh, you have two now.
For the documentation for how to add a new slot, is that documentation that lives in the Frontend Plugin Framework repo? Where do I find the docs to like do this in the future?
I don't know if we have all the best practices documented somewhere yet.
Oh, is that something that you would like help with?
I would love help with that.
Okay.
Yes. In fact, I was still learning some of the best practices myself as I put together the slides for this.
We do at least have examples of slots that you can reference. So when building out the docs, we'll be able to look at the ones that already exist, especially the ones in Learner Dashboard and Learning, and then kind of work from there to establish those best practices and then get them into more formal documentation. But we are a step above, hey, we just have plugin slot with undefined, unconventioned ID sitting in some component somewhere.
Yeah, and I think I fully recognize that like literally the moment when I asked this question is the earliest moment where we could have actually had any docs. So like it makes sense that you don't have them yet, but it feels like it's mature enough based on just having done the stuff so far that we could definitely write this up in a way that's approachable.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, up until like a week before Redwood, we didn't have the concept of not directly using plugin slot and instead making that its own component that then lives somewhere and has documentation around how this slot works. So at least getting to encode some level of documentation was a good step towards where we hope to be.
We're planning on having a birds of a feather session about pluggability as well. So keep an eye out.
Come discuss.
Yep. You just
So it's just a question and a little bit of trolling. No. So I'm an amazing front-end developer, as you know. I know jQuery very well, for instance. In jQuery, to debug something, I would just console log. How do I do that in React? Like, I want to console log the children, for instance.
You can just console log the children.
It's complaining syntax.
Oh, so
something.
see here, this is set up using the fat arrow function syntax where it returns an object. So this function doesn't have any code, it just returns an object. But if you change the syntax, this is actually a function here, this component. And if you change the syntax to say function unit content slot, these are the parameters, and then you use the curly braces to define the body, and you explicitly add a return statement to return plugin slot and children. Then with that syntax, you can put a line at the beginning of the function, and you can say console log children. So that will work. Also, there is a React browser extension that you can install in your browser, and it adds a components tab to the element inspector, and you can inspect element on any component that you see in the React application, and then click on the React Components tab, and it will show you all the React components, all their props, all the current state of everything, and it lets you dig around in a lot more detail. So it's invaluable for debugging React applications. But yeah, good old console log still works too. It's just, this is a value right here, so you can't put an imperative function call in a value expression. How's everyone doing with getting to step 5?
Just a reminder, especially if you, or it's new if you weren't here before, these VMs are going to be cleaned out and closed by the end of the day. So if you're doing stuff in there that you want to keep for whatever reason, copy it over locally. Okay.
I changed the text, but where is this to copy and paste?
Oh, it's in the PR. Go to the README. You know what the README is?
Yes.
Okay, go to the code.
Here. Okay. Yes.
Then look at the files changed. Here. So these are the actual changes. You can download the file. You can see it if you click on the. You can view just the whole file.
Okay.
Which makes it easier to copy.
Okay. But
And then I suggest copying it from here instead of the slides. There's a better chance of actually working.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just show that to everyone. So in case you didn't see this, if you go to the repo for this workshop from the shortened link, at the end is this link, Advanced Frontend Pluggability Code, and if you, as well as a link to the slides. So you can use the slides link to work ahead or catch up, and if you click on the code link, you'll get to this pull request, and then you can see, for example, some of the stuff is working ahead, but you can see here, here is the code for the plugin slot. And if you click here, here's the code for modifying the unit page. So all the code for everything we do today is in that pull request.
you don't mind, in the meanwhile, could you tell us a bit more about what does the plugin slot thing we import do behind the scenes? Like a quick overview? Like what were some challenges that you faced to get that in place?
That's front-end plugin framework question, I guess.
Yeah. So while people are working on that, Monsef was asking me about the design of the front-end plugin framework and how it actually works in terms of the slot and the plugins. So I originally had a just one second. So I originally actually came up with some of the ideas for this plugin slot framework working on a different application where I had lots of sidebars and navigation bars and stuff that I wanted to be pluggable. And so I just thought of the idea, why don't we make that a plugin slot where each sort of nav item is a default widget in the slot, and then plugins can add new links among the existing links or reorder them or hide them or add icons to them or whatever. That was the original use case that I personally had for working with plugins and slots. And then when we had this big Frontend Pluggability Summit, I sort of shared my experience in creating those plugins and slots. And was it mostly Adam from 2U?
Actually, it was Jason Wesson.
Oh, Jason Wesson, yeah.
That picked up the development of that.
Right.
So we had a summit. This is actually relevant information. We tried not to dictate how things happen. We try to ask how people think things should happen. And the way it worked this time is we had this big meeting. So Braden presented his idea. Felipe presented his. We had the third. You had two ideas in there.
Yeah. The iframes was the third.
Yeah. And then we talked about it. It's like, what do we do? We have these good ideas. What do we do next? Let's implement them. So we had 2 or 3 competing implementations as PRs. And we agreed to merge them to localized places, such as to one MFE we do this, to the other one we do this, and then we compare them in practice. It turns out that this idea worked out the best for most people. And in the second summit, we decided, okay, let's use this as the official one. So this is how we came to the front-end plugin framework repository you can see now, right?
And if you want to see the technical details of how it works, you can go to the front-end plugin framework repo and browse the code there. Basically, when this plugin slot, this is just a typical React component, and when it goes to render, what it does is it checks the configuration and it looks for all the plugins that are registered. As we'll get to that step, but we did it already in the earlier tutorial. It looks for all the plugins that are registered with the same ID as the slot has. And then there is a function. It basically loops through each plugin, and one at a time it does what each plugin says. So if the plugin says insert, it inserts it into the list of widgets that are in the slot. If the plugin says to wrap, then it will wrap one, which we'll get to as another example. If it says to hide something that's already there, then it will hide something. And it just goes through every list of changes to that slot, and then it renders the result. And it memoizes it for performance, so it doesn't have to do that every time the tree is re-rendered. But it's fairly simple. It's not doing anything too fancy. There's nothing too fancy. In fact, the plugins, as we're developing them here, are sort of just hard. Like they become part of your MFEs bundle, and they're almost as if you would put them right in the code where the slot is. If your plugin is really large and complicated, you should actually use react.lazy to lazy load it at runtime, and then it will be in a separate bundle, and the browser will actually load it separately. For most of this type of plugins we're seeing here, that's totally not necessary, though. It's much more efficient to just do it like we're doing it here and put it directly into the MFE.
Eventually, as part of you've been hearing about OEP 65, module federation and all that, you're going to get a plugin type that does exactly that. Pull in from somewhere else. Right? It'll do the React lazy for you. We don't have that yet, but
Can I see who's still working on this first part? With hands? Okay. Shall we move on then? Okay. Yeah, feel free to use the slides to work ahead if you're very keen, or if you need to catch up. I'll start moving on. So by now you should have this part where we've changed the unit contents into a slot, but so far it doesn't look any different. That's good news. Now we're going to create a plugin sandwich. So what that means is we'll put a plugin before and we'll put a plugin after, and you'll have the unit in the middle, and it'll be a tasty sandwich. So for step 6 of this workshop, here's how you can create a plugin. And so as we did in the basic workshop, this will go in the env.config.jsx. And that goes in the root folder of the MFE, not in the source folder. For this MFE, the file probably won't exist, so you'll have to create it in Frontend App Learning. And here is the contents of this new config file. Again, you can copy this either from the slides. This should be copyable right from the slide here, or from the GitHub pull request that we linked to. So the important things here are we import the front-end plugin framework, we define the config. The most important thing is the ID of the slot, so this has to match the ID that we defined in the JSX file for the unit contents slot. We definitely want to keep the unit contents there, otherwise learners won't see anything at all in the course. So we want to say keep default true. And then for plugins, we'll just have a list and it will contain one plugin. We're going to be inserting it above the content. And so to do that, you define this field called widget. And in there, you put an ID. The ID doesn't really matter, but you can call it before unit content in this case. I think the idea for the IDs was to be able to reference plugins relative to each other, to say this one should appear after that one or before this one, but we didn't really implement that in the end.
Yeah,
so
it's not there yet.
So this ID is not really used for much, but you can put whatever you want for the ID. Then, as we'll see, the priority is important. So something to know is that the default contents has a priority of 50, and the higher the priority, the lower it will be in the list. So if you want it to come before the unit, give it a priority like 10, anything lower than 50, and it will come before the unit. We'll see on the next example, if you give a priority 80, it will come after the unit. So the actual number doesn't matter, but if you have multiple plugins in the slot, you can use the priority to set the order that they appear. And this is also how you choose if it's coming before or after the default contents. So for this example, what we're making is this blue header that appears before the unit. So give it a priority of 10. The type is direct plugin because it's not an iframe. And then the last thing that's required is render widget. And in this case, you can either import it from another file and just put the name of the React component there, or for simplicity, for the purposes of this workshop, you can just put it right in your env.config.jsx file. So that's what I'm showing here. And basically, this is a React component, so it's a function. It takes props, and then it returns some HTML, basically, JSX. In this case, all we're doing is making it blue, giving the text white, adding some padding, and then saying this unit is, and here we're accessing the unit ID from the props. So as you'll remember in the earlier step, we defined that the unit ID and the course ID get passed in. So those two things are available in props. Here, for this one, we'll access the unit ID and put that as a new plugin before the unit. And then for symmetry, the next step will be to insert a second plugin, which appears after the unit. So it's the same, you just give it a different ID, give it a priority 80, and it will appear below the units. And in this case, in this example, I put the course ID. So the end result will be this. You get the unit ID coming before the unit, and you get the course ID coming after the unit. And as we'll see, you could do more elaborate things. For example, you have the unit ID. You can call an API and say, you know, did the user rate this unit? I think Felipe had a use case where after the unit, they were putting little stars, and you could rate each unit out of 5 stars, for example. So to do that, you need to know the unit ID. This is how you get it. You would call an API, say, has the user rated this unit yet? Get that back, and then you can display the stars rating or a widget to let them do it. We'll see a more complicated example with an API, but for now, this is how you insert a really simple plugin. Any questions about this step?
Is the plugin slot will always have priority 50? Is that just like a default set in the plugin slot?
So the default content always
Default
has
content, I see.
priority 50, yeah.
Got it.
So that's just a convention that
Got
we
it.
use.
Cool.
You can add as many plugins as you want, and if you set keep default false, then there is no default contents in there.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
but yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Shidich has a question.
So the operations that are applied, like there's an insert, wrap, is that like cumulative? Like if you insert 3 items and then you wrap it, does it wrap the result of those insertions, or is it only working on the original?
It doesn't wrap the result, I believe. But actually, I have to check. I don't.
Have to check.
Yeah.
I haven't tried that.
I will say that the order that you define the plugins in this file affects that. So you can use the priority to sort the plugins as they're rendered to the user, but if there's any operations that aren't where the order matters, it would matter the order that you put them in this unconfig file. But I believe the way that the function works when it renders the contents, it kind of gets all the ones that are going to be inserted and then all the ones that are going to be wrapped and so on, and it kind of processes them in a different way. So yeah, that's something that we could make more clear, because even I don't know off the top of my head the answer to that question.
How about if there is a priority clash? Like two items are in the
Okay, so the question was, what if there's a priority clash if you have 2 items with priority 10? And you'd probably get some undetermined behavior. So it would just, you don't know what order they would appear in, but it wouldn't cause any problems. Some users would see one plugin before another, potentially, depending on what JavaScript engine they're using and the phase of the moon, anything like that. But it won't crash or anything.
Those were good questions, though.
I mean, it's just an array, and the priority is used as a sort key, so. And yeah, just to show you, if you have the slides open, you can literally just select the code here like this and copy it out and paste it into your environment if you'd like. Or you can get it from the PR. And this env.config.jsx file is just a normal JavaScript file, so you can put comments in it, unlike a JSON file. So I recommend you liberally put comments in there to say what each of your plugins is doing and why it's there. Too many config files have stuff that is very hard to understand when you come back to them later, so the more comments you can put in, the better. Why is the priority 80? Say it with a comment. What is this plugin doing? Saying with a comment.
Out of curiosity or historical curiosity, env-config.js does not exist because of this. It came before it. This use is sort of a vindication of having built an env-config.js file that can take any JavaScript, right? So because it can take any JavaScript, we can do all this in that file. So if you look into front-end platform, I think, there's an ADR that adds just the env-config.js.
If you've already got this working, feel free to mess around with it. Try adding more plugins. Try changing them to display a photo of you or whatever you'd like.
Yeah, try breaking stuff.
Yeah.
So if you can, tell us how you did it.
In the env file, you have used TanStack query or any third-party dependency, and then you have to update the package.json accordingly, and that is happening in the main repo. So does that mean if I want to use any third-party dependency, I would have to update the package.json of the front-end repo?
Okay, great question, and we'll kind of get to that because you're jumping ahead on the slides. But the answer is no, you don't have to add dependencies to the main MFE. You can install them with your plugin. You just have to make sure, so you have your MFE, and then when you go to deploy it, you have some build process where you run npm run build, and at that point, you also need to install your plugins. So we're not really prescribing a way to do that for now. In the future, that's something that we'll figure out, and we'll have a way with tutor plugins or something to manage it. But for now, you have to have your own build process where you build the MFE and you add the env-config.jsx file. At that same point, you can also install any plugins you need. And when you install your plugin, if you've published it on npm and you've listed any dependencies, they'll get installed then during the build process. So if you have dependencies, third-party applications you want to call, then don't just package your plugin in env-config.jsx like this. Make a full npm package for your plugin. Create a package.json file, list the dependencies, and then, yeah, it'll get installed. But yeah, you don't.
Just quick note, Tutor already allows you to npm install something after everything, right? So you just need to provide the env-config.js, which it does not have a mechanism, like an explicit mechanism for yet, but we're working on it. Kyle.
And on a future slide, I'll talk about how to publish your plugin on NPM, which is actually extremely easy.
Can a plugin slot appear multiple times, like be used multiple times?
Great question, and the answer is yes. So if you want to define this same plugin slot in multiple places, it will always have the same contents, in case that's not obvious. But yes, you can put the same plugin slot anywhere you want in the app, and the same things will appear. So it's not just for one thing. If you have some repeating pattern in your MFE, you can turn that component into a slot, and yeah, everywhere the plugin slot appears, the same plugins will appear. Also, plugins can themselves, we mentioned this a little bit before, but plugins can themselves contain slots, and you can have plugins all the way down if you want to.
So if you do define a plugin slot multiple times, and in each of those places it like wraps a different thing, and you don't hide it, do you just see whatever that default thing is for that version of the slot, I assume? Cool.
Yeah. So that's a good point. The default contents could be different in different ones, but the same list of plugins would apply, and it would do the same operations to them.
That would be useful, I think, in a plugin that wraps a route, for example, and does interesting things to where things go.
As one use case off the top of my head, if you had usernames appearing throughout your MFE, say it's a forum MFE or something, you could turn each username into a plugin slot, and then you could have a plugin that when people hover over usernames, you see their avatar or something. That would work perfectly fine. So there would be hundreds of plugin slots, and the same plugin would add the sort of avatar hover over each username. But it would work totally fine, and it would be quite efficient too. The plugin framework is very lean, so you could do something like that if you wanted. For now, we're mostly focusing on one-off use cases.
Do I have to define the plugin slot as a function in the plugin-slots directory, or can I import the plugin slot component directly into the place where I want a plugin slot?
I'll let Brian take that.
Yeah, if you look at the front-end slot footer repo, you will see that that is being imported all over the place and being used directly. The idea of having slots defined as components in a directory in an MFE itself was a step above just directly using plugin slot and having them hide throughout all these other components. So it's kind of just a level of organization that we got, and then if you want to have a slot that's used in multiple MFEs, you can import that from anywhere.
Can I see who has the slot working so far? Okay. Quite a few people. Does anyone want us to wait a bit longer? Okay. So let's move on to the next step. So that's how you create a plugin sandwich. And then now we're going to look at how to, so this will be our first look at a different operation besides inserting a plugin. Now we're going to look at how you can wrap the default contents. Oh, and actually this will answer Kyle's question. I just realized, so I should have known the answer. And so our goal for this step is to build on what you have so far and create a blur overlay for the contents. So normally you wouldn't do this just in the front end, but as an example, if you had some sort of use case where you want to blur out the contents of the course until the learner does something, this will be how you could do it on the front end only. So in this case, we're going to blur out the default contents and show a little modal that says, are you sure you want to learn this now? And then if the learner clicks yes, ooh, interactivity, then we'll unblur the contents and show them. So as you can see here, we're going to wrap the default contents and blur it, but you can see the blur doesn't affect the plugin below or above. So in this case, the answer to Kyle's question is wrap will only affect the default contents. It doesn't affect the other plugins. So this is our goal. And to do that, here is all the code you need on one screen. You can do it right from the env-config.jsx file as well, just by adding a third plugin. So this time, instead of insert, we're going to say that the operation is pluginoperations.wrap. Here, you specify explicitly which plugin we're going to wrap. So it turns out that the default contents turns into a widget. We already know it has priority 50. It also turns out it has the ID default_contents. So if that's the one that you want to wrap, then you explicitly say, I want to wrap the default contents. If you had your own plugin that's inserted in a slot, and then later you have a second plugin that you want to wrap your previous plugin, I don't know why you would want to do that, but you could specify the ID there. But there's probably other ways to achieve that same effect. So the most common reason to do a wrap would be if you want to wrap the default contents. So in that case, specify widget ID default contents. And in that case, you'll see that you get a prop called component passed into your React component. And so here's an example. This time we're not using the fat arrow syntax. We are using the fat arrow syntax, but we're not just returning a value immediately. We're defining the body of a function. And so we can, in this case, use React hooks. So the first line of code in our new plugin is going to create a React state variable. It's just a Boolean which says is blurred, is true or false, and then a function called setBlur, which we can use to change that Boolean's value. So if you're not familiar with React hooks, this might look a little bit unusual, but this is just the syntax for how to create a state in a React component that can remember some value. And the main thing about hooks is they have to come at, all the hooks have to come before you return anything. So you have to define them usually at the beginning of your component's implementation. And then we're just going to have a simple if condition. If is blurred is true, we're going to return this HTML here. And as you can see, we're just going to define a div that has position relative, and that will let us position the modal relative to the blurred contents. Then we're going to create a child div and use CSS filter blur to get that nice Gaussian blur effect. And then we'll also say pointer events none. That prevents the user from clicking through. If you don't have this, it will be blurred, but they can still click on it and select text and stuff like that. Obviously, anyone with inspect element can hack around this, so this is not a foolproof scheme, but it's just for our example today. And then With the wrap operation, you get this component property passed to your component. So wherever you want the default contents to appear, in this case, in this branch of the if statement, we want it to appear inside this div that applies the blur. So we'll put it there. We can't really modify it in any way. We can just put more HTML around it. So that's what we're doing, is surrounding it with these new divs. And then this is a hacky modal that I coded up. It would be better to use a Paragon modal or do something more accessible. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I just showed something really hacky. So this is how you can use CSS to position a div over top of it. And then, are you sure you want to learn this now? For this, if you're copying this code, you also need to change the import at the beginning to import React and import button from Paragon. And then we use a Paragon button. So this is a little bit of Paragon is used in this example. And then the key to making this work is on click, we need to say set blur false. And that will update, when the user clicks yes, it will update the React state and it will re-render the plugin. And this time, if is blurred will be false, so it won't render all those divs with the blurs. We'll just return the component as is without any new divs around it. And that's all you need. And then if you copy this code and put it in as a third plugin in the env-config JSX, and don't forget to add these imports at the top, you should get this exact thing here. When you load the unit page, you'll see that it's blurred out until you click yes, and then the modal will disappear and it will be unblurred. So try it out. So there is also a hide operation which completely removes the default contents, but it's not conditional. So if you ever have a use case where you want a plugin to be able to check something and then based on that check show the default contents or not, then you have to use this wrap, and this is an example. We're blurring it, but you could also hide it completely if you want until the learner clicks yes or enters a password or whatever you want. We are not really sure how much of a use case there is for the wrap, modify, and hide commands. So interested in hearing your feedback about whether this is actually a realistic use case or not. Come on. Wait, can you get a microphone? So that
Test. Have you thought about implementing wrap as an insert operation and passing the component itself as a prop or something like that? Like, isn't wrap a subset of the insert operation? Or?
it could be implemented that way.
Yeah.
And I think someone had suggested that to Jason at the time, or Jason had thought about it. We decided to go this way for simplicity for now, or to be more explicit about what you're doing. But yes, I think the API could be simplified, and some of those operations, like hide, is a subset of wrap. You just return nothing.
And wrap is a subset of insert with the component passed as a prop.
And wrap can be a subset of insert. Yeah. So the API could be simplified or streamlined if we wanted to, but that would make insert more complicated. Yeah, I think Brian wants to add on to my answer.
Just one quick more thing.
Sure.
I think there must only be one wrap operation also per plugin slot.
Oh, good question. And no, you can
You
wrap,
can wrap multiple
a
times?
wrapped component if you want to. Yeah. So.
Yeah, but we can only have one plugin that wraps the default content.
No, so what happens is once you wrap the default contents, that becomes the new component that gets passed to the next one, and it can wrap.
So it's functionally composed
exactly.
somehow. Okay. Thank you.
Brian wants to add on to your answer, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the hide operation and keep default seem like kind of having two ways to do the same thing as well. Because you could just say insert nothing, don't keep default, and that's the equivalent of hide.
Yeah.
Especially now that I think keep default.
Keeps it in
No.
Yeah.
So we're talking about stable APIs and plugin extension points. I would consider the insert API fairly stable, but these other ones, you might see them disappear in a future release or be combined into one or consolidated somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is about the use cases of exactly this wrap. OpenEdX filters, we've used them. They work in the backend, in the server rendering. So we have a few that operate over the templates that are rendering what to render, what to hide. So I think this is pretty useful, and it could work as a replacement.
Yeah.
Currently, some of them are working in instructor dashboard, in the legacy learner dashboard.
Okay.
That's been replaced with MFEs. So that was a workload that we had. And yeah, I don't know how they will work, but I think that would work.
Okay, great. Arthur?
Yes, hello. I have two questions actually. One follows up with the question of whether you can have multiple wrapping plugins. I see that this one doesn't have a priority specified anywhere. So is that just because since you just added one, it doesn't really make sense to add the priority? And if you had more than one, you then could use the priority to determine the order in which they would wrap?
So in this case, if you had two plugins that are both wrapping the default contents, it would be the order that you define them in the env-config JSX file that determines which is the inner plugin and which is the outer plugin. So the priority is not necessary because it's more about the order that you put them in the config file. Whichever one you put first will wrap the default contents, and then whichever one you put second will get that wrapped default contents as the component and can wrap it at a final time. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Another question. Is there a way for two plugins to communicate with each other in some way?
Good question. We don't have an API for that, and there are ways to do it. It depends on your use case. So do you have something specific in mind?
Yes, actually, I was thinking, what if I wanted to extend the blur to the sandwich components we just added previously, and we would have to have the clicking the yes button in the main one, also change the blur for the other ones, also communicate that change in state. Will that be possible?
So there's several different ways you could do that. I don't know if I like any of them, but for example, you could just use a global variable to store a list of the units that have been unblurred, and then just check that, and it would work fine. If you wanted the user's thing to be remembered, then you should use a cookie or store it on the server. In that case, each plugin doesn't have to communicate with the other plugins. They just have to load the state from the server. And as we'll see, if you use React Query to load that from the server, then it handles all that for you. Then the plugins will stay in sync. So you could have 3 different plugins. They could each store the state on the server. As long as you use React Query, when the user unblurs via any one of those 3 plugins, they would all become unblurred, and it would remember across refreshes. So that would be how I recommend you do it, is if you had this somewhere to store the state on the server, I would say, as well, we'll get to an example of how to use React Query to load data from the server. But otherwise, we don't have a formal API for that. You can use global variables, you can use cookies, you can use Broadcast Channel is a really cool API available in browsers that lets you keep all the tabs in sync if a user has multiple tabs open. So they unblur it in one, it unblurs in every tab. You could also use Redux state if the MFE has a global store, which they usually do. I don't know if you can inject a new state thing into the Redux state, but if there's somewhere in the Redux state to store it, you could do it there too. I personally wouldn't go that way, but you have lots of options basically.
Thank you.
In at least one case, we already have a plugin that manipulates a Redux store. I think it's Frontend App Learning itself, yeah. But not directly. So the way we implemented the slot is there's a callback in the Redux that lets you manipulate the Redux store. So a plugin can go in and if you register the plugin correctly, it will be called, so you can manipulate that variable in the Redux store. I'll find it and I'll find the link soon and send it over.
But that requires the MFE sort of know about that use case.
It's this, the plugin architecture for that MFE, for that case, was developed like this, right? It's not a generic situation. But it does beg the question of, shouldn't we have a generic way to let this inter-plugin communication or data storage work, right? We don't have an answer for that yet, but it's possible.
I would argue the best approach depends on so many factors that you have the tools already available to you. I don't know that we need an API for it formally. Has anyone been able to get this blur working? Yeah. Cool. Can I see who's still working on this step? Okay. Okay, we'll give another minute or two and then we'll move on to the next part. Any more questions in the meantime? Regis? Yes. Wait, can you get a mic?
Maybe you already explained that, but I was really distracted by my neighbor. I'm very sorry about this. Like, how do you style components in React? Like, if you wanted to load, to style a slot with SCSS, how would you easily load some SCSS there?
So it's kind of strange, but because we're using Webpack, it will handle SCSS, so your plugin can reference SCSS very easily, and just anywhere in the plugin function body in the component. Actually, no, I think what you have to do is you have to move the plugin implementation to a separate file, and then at the top of that file, you import the SCSS. So this code here, everything, it's wrapper, colon, and then it lists all this implementation here. All that JSX and JavaScript for the React component, move that to a separate JSX file. And then at the beginning of the file, you just put an import statement and say import./styles.scss or something, and then put a file there with that SCSS in it. And Webpack, via its magic as it does the build, will make sure that this SCSS gets injected as needed.
And I think you can look at Felipe's example from this morning for the footer for
Yes.
an example of that import, because he does that import of CSS into the component footer that he defines. So there's
It was
an example
just
in the code
plain
up there.
CSS, but you can do SCSS as well.
Right.
I will say, if you're doing that, you have to watch out for a very common footgun that traps a lot of people, which is if you import the Paragon SCSS because you want to use Paragon variables. Congrats, you've just added like 400 kilobytes of CSS to the MFE build. So you have to be very careful about how to import the Paragon variables without importing all the Paragon styles into your plugin. If you do it the way that feels right, you'll get a full copy of Paragon added to the MFE. So you have to use a few lines of code to import the variables. This pain will be gone with design tokens and moving away from SCSS imports. But watch out for that if you're doing it. Any more questions? Otherwise, we can move on.
Just to comment on a previous one. If you look in Frontend App Learning, and you grep for use plugins callback in camel case, you're going to find instances of a generic plugin store, right? So that's the way we did it. We have a store that can be used by plugins for coordinate for data, right? You can store whatever you want there, and plugins can get it. So if you're interested, just take a look at that. It's one way you could do it.
Okay, continuing on our tour of features that might come up during plugin development, next is accessing user data. So a very common use case with, for example, the star ratings that I told you about. You obviously want the ratings to be specific to the user. So to do that, you need to know something about the user and either make authenticated requests to some API or get the user ID or the username, whatever it may be. So there's a very well-defined pattern for accessing user data in our MFEs, and you can do the same thing in your plugin anywhere you want. In this case, for this example, I'm just showing how to modify the previous blur example to put the username in the dialog. And it's very simple. So you just import app context from Frontend Platform. And then in your code, the two lines that are new are blurred here, are bolded here. So you add this hook at the beginning. Again, it has to come before any conditional returns. But you just say, we're using destructuring syntax here, so the React.use context app context returns a bunch of data defined by Frontend Platform. One of those things it returns is the authenticated user. This is a very stable API. You can count on it in your plugins. It's not specific to any MFE, so this will work in any MFE in OpenEdX. Authenticated user may be null or undefined in some circumstances if the user is not logged in. So that's why you can see here when I go to use the username, I use this question mark dot syntax. So if the authenticated user is defined, we get their username. If it's not defined, we just say learner as a sort of generic substitute. In the learning MFE, I don't think you would normally see this page if you're not logged in, but it's good practice to account for it anyways. And just as we're accessing username here, you can also access the user ID. And if you're familiar with Frontend Platform, it provides a similar function called like make authenticated API requests or something like that, you can use that to make API requests on behalf of the user to edX platform. So basically, the way that you access information about the user or any other part of front-end platform is the same in a plugin as it is anywhere else in the MFE. But it's good to be aware of front-end platform and what data it does provide. For example, if you didn't know this, you might try to define your plugin slot to have a prop for the user and pass the user data down. That, in this case, that would be a bad practice because you're defining props that we don't need. Anything that's really standard can come from the front-end platform context like this. So go ahead and try that out. It's just 3 new lines, 1 to import the app context, 1 to get the authenticated user from the context in your React component, and then 1 to display the username in the modal. And if it works, you should see your name or OpenEdX or the name of whatever user you're using in the modal. Now, in some cases, the MFE might have its own context, and it might provide other data that you can access using use context and get the data from the React context. In general, that's starting to couple the MFE very strongly with the plugin very strongly with the MFE, and technically, that sort of context is not part of the plugin contract. So I would recommend not doing that if possible. And instead, if there is some really important data that's in a React context, you should make it explicitly part of the slot's properties and pass it into the plugin explicitly. And that way, plugins have a stable API, and later the MFE can refactor its context without breaking plugins. So, yeah.
In other words, we're not promising to not change the context. We're promising to make an effort to not change the props that you pass down to the plugins.
But in this case, this context comes from front-end platform. It's a very stable API, as I mentioned, and it's in every MFE. It's exactly the same. So this you can totally use in a plugin. I would say the same about the Redux state as well, the Redux store of the MFE. If you're tempted to access some data that's in there, instead make it explicitly modify the MFE to explicitly pass that data from the Redux store into the props of the plugin. And that way, it's very clear what's part of your API and what's not.
But you might end up in a situation where the maintainer of the MFE doesn't want that in the plugin slot props. So you may have to, if you want to be sure your plugin will have a long life without modification, you can go ahead and fetch that information again from the server, which is completely possible. By the way, the the function is get authenticated HTTP client.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
I realized that after I said it was. Any questions about this? Okay. That one is just 3 lines of code, so I'm going to keep going to using an API. So this one will be a little more involved. This is my sort of opinionated best practices version of how to use an API. There are many different ways you could do this. In this case, I'm not going to use an OpenEdX API. I'm going to use a third-party API. To use an OpenEdX API is similar, but you can use the get authenticated HTTP client that Adolfo was just mentioning. So I'll show you later where to do it. But first of all, anytime you're fetching data from the server, you have a few different ways you can go. You can just fetch data directly and then handle yourself the different loading, error states, or you can use Redux and Redux toolkit and stuff to kind of wrap your code for fetching the data from the server and keeping track of, are we loading data from the server? Was there an error, and so on. And that way you can keep it in sync in different places in your MFE. But the approach that I recommend very strongly, and which we're starting to use more in different MFEs, but is still kind of new to the OpenEdX front ends, is using this really nice framework called React Query. And I have a lightning talk on this later this week, so if you're interested in this, you can either come to my lightning talk or watch the replay later. There was also a front-end study group session on React Query. You can see the recording of that, and it goes into a lot of detail, much more than I can in a lightning talk about React Query. But basically, React Query, it's actually generic to many different front ends, so you can use it with Vue, and you can use it with all these other things. So they call it TAN-stack query, but when we're using it with React, we call it React Query. And it's a very nice framework. They call it a state management framework or something, but I think of it as a framework. Anytime you want to load data from the server, React Query is a great way to do it, and it takes care of the things you always need to worry about, which is, are we currently loading data? And did we have an error loading the data? And then can we keep the data in sync in all the different places in our front end? So basically what React Query does is, in any component in your front end where you need some piece of data from the server, you use React Query to define that piece of data that you need from the server and how to fetch it. And then it will provide you with a isLoading prop, which you can use to render a loading state. It will provide you with an isError prop that you can use to check if an error went wrong. And if you use the same API endpoint in many different places in your front end, it will keep them in sync, and it will deduplicate the requests. So you can have 100 plugins that each request the star rating of a given unit, and it will only make one request to the server to get that star rating. And then later, if you use what's called the invalidation to say that you've updated it on the server, anywhere in your MFE that you are using that data will be updated to show the new version from the server. It also does things like infinite queries, pagination, and a lot of other functionality that you may need. So I'm a huge fan of React Query. It really makes it a lot simpler to fetch data from the server and follow all the best practices that you should be. The one catch is in Redwood, most of our MFEs are not using React Query yet, although some are. So if you want to use it for your plugin, which I recommend because it helps keep your plugin decoupled from the MFE, you may have to do this step where you add React Query to the MFE. So this is how you do that. So if the MFE doesn't already have React Query installed, and if you want to use React Query for your plugin to fetch data from the server, which is my personal recommendation if you need to fetch data from an API. Whether it's an OpenEdX API or a third-party API, it doesn't matter. Then you'll have to follow this step. So just as we're modifying the MFE to add a plugin slot, at the same time you can modify the MFE to add React query. This is the npm install command. There's some weird conflicts because we're using an old version of React, and some of our dependencies are somehow installing types from a new version of React, and React query depends on the types of React 17. There's some crazy thing going on with npm. So I found that you have to type -- force when you're installing React query 4.
It's not uncommon.
Yeah. It's not a big deal. It's just some conflict in types packages, which we're not even using. So it's not going to cause any problems. But that's the install command. And then you have to add this query client and query client provider to your MFE's index.jsx file. So typically the index.jsx file, it has a whole bunch of context providers. It has the app context provider from Frontend Platform. It has, I think in the learning MFE, it has like 5 or 6 different context providers. So this is just another one. It's this React component that goes around all your other React components and makes React query available to everything in your MFE, and in this case to all your plugins as well. So you would run this npm install command, and then these 4 lines that I've bolded are the new lines. You import React query, you define a query client, and then you use query client provider to create a new React context that makes that available to everything in the React application. The details of this aren't super important for our purposes today, but if you are in this situation where you want to use React query because it's really awesome and the MFE doesn't have it yet, just refer back to these slides, and this is an example of how you can install it. And then here's an example of a plugin using React query to call an API. So this is a new plugin that we're adding to our list of 3 plugins we've already created for the unit page. We have the thing that comes above, we have the thing that goes below, and then we have the blur plugin. This is a 4th plugin that's going to show a random image of a dog after each unit. And we're going to use React query to do that. So the first few lines are all the same as you've seen before. We're going to do an insert operation. The ID will be called after unit dog because we have a dog picture. Priority will be 90, so it will appear at the very bottom. And then here's the React code for our plugin. And again, the details of this aren't super important. If you're interested in learning React query, that would be a whole nother workshop. But basically, it's a React hook where you say use query, and then it will return a whole bunch of things you can use, like the data that you want to fetch from the server, an isLoading variable, and an error variable. And one nice property is React query guarantees that only one of these 3 things will be truthy at any given time. So either we're loading, or there was an error, or there is data. And as long as you handle those 3 cases, then you'll be following the best practices for how to display stuff to the user. So this takes care of a lot of boilerplate for you. If you're using Redux or rolling your own code, you have to be very careful about how to define when we're loading data from the server and how to handle error states and so on. But with React query, it provides that all for you. There's also isFetching, which is more complicated if you want to show a different state when the data is already loaded but is being refreshed. There's a lot more features, but these are the main 3 that you need to know with React query: the data, isLoading, and error. And then skipping past query key for a second, the main heart of what we're doing is this query function that you see right here. So you tell React query how to fetch the piece of data that you want from the server. And in this case, we're literally just going to use the fetch API to say await fetch, and then pass in the URL of this dogs API that I found. And then it returns JSON data. So if you're using fetch API like we are here, you just await response.json, and it will parse the string as JSON. And then this particular API, the dog URL that we're looking for comes in a field called message. So we access .message. And that's it. That's how we fetch the data from the API. The next thing that you need to do is define a query key. And this is how React Query deduplicates different requests. So you just have to, it's an array of strings that uniquely identifies the piece of data that we're fetching from the server. So in this case, if we want a different dog picture to appear on each unit, we have to make sure that the query key includes the unit ID. And that way, if several different plugins request a dog picture for the same unit, they'll have the same query key and only one request will go out to the API. But if the user clicks through different units, we'll make a new request to the API for each unit, and there will be a new dog appearing on each unit. So for the query key, I just said after unit dog as the first part, and then unit ID as the second part. This is just an array of strings, and it doesn't matter what they are, as long as it uniquely identifies the data that you want from the server. And then React Query has these really nice features for development, like when you make some changes in your code or in Django admin and then click back on your browser, it will refresh from the server. For this example, we don't want that. And likewise, we don't need it to refresh when the component first appears. So I just set those things to false. And then here you can see how we handle the is loading and the error states. So if we're still loading the data, just return a div that says loading. If the data is not there, that means there must be an error because only one of those three things is truthy at any time. So display the error message, and then otherwise display the picture of the dog, and we get the URL for that picture from the API. If you wanted to use an OpenEdX API, you could write this exactly the same way, just instead of using fetch to retrieve the data, you would use the authenticated query client from Frontend Platform, and it will take care of setting the right cookies or headers to make the request as the current user. But everything else would be the same. So if you copy that and paste it as a fourth plugin, and you add React Query to the MFE, what you'll find is it looks like this. It will display a random picture of a dog at the end of the unit. And if you have multiple units, you'll see as you switch back and forth between the units, the same unit gets the same dog picture because of how we set up the unit ID in the query key. So that's an example of loading data from the API. I'm not going to turn this into a React Query talk, so if you're interested in more, like I said, you can check out the lightning talk that I'm going to be giving later this week, or the front-end, what's it called, study group session on React Query. But I strongly recommend using React Query to load data from the server because it helps you follow all the best practices about handling loading and errors. And it will cover that use case where, for example, if you have 3 different plugins and they're loading the same piece of data from the server, if any one of them changes it, it will refresh the data in all the plugins simultaneously, and the whole UI will stay in sync. So, Mansef?
You actually just spoke of making use of the existing front-end libraries in the slot plugin. I have a question regarding dependency duplication. So if we build our plugin into its own repo with its own dependencies, would the dependencies be duplicated, or how would that work exactly?
I'll show you, in a second, but they will be deduplicated. So given that React Query is kind of an advanced use case, I'm not going to wait here, but if you want to work through the React Query example on your own, or I'm happy to come help you with it later on. But for now, I'm just going to go through the finishing touches, which is the last step of the advanced workshop. So going back, taking a step back from defining plugins for a second and going back to where we started with modifying the MFE to create a new plugin slot, we copied the JSX file from an existing slot and we used that to define our new slot. To finish that up and make a pull request, you should also create a README for your new plugin slot. And in the same way, you can copy one of the existing READMEs, which are really nice, and there's a screenshot of one. And these are all the things that your README should include: the ID of the slot, the props that are passed into it, a description, just explain to people what it does, include a screenshot. So that's very helpful for people to understand it at a glance. And then give an example of the use case to justify why we have this plugin slot. And once you have that, you're ready to open a pull request and add your plugin slot to the MFE. I think also, oh yeah, no, that's all you need. So please create READMEs and follow what we're doing in the Learning MFE, where we're putting all the slots in one folder, and each folder has its own README and its own implementation file.
If you find one that's not, it's wrong. We'll fix it.
Obviously, this isn't required, but it is a best practice, which we would like to see. And so the last topic I'm going to cover with the slides, and then we can just chat for the rest of the session, is publishing plugins to NPM. And I actually just added this between the beginner workshop and the advanced workshop when I realized that it was a good topic to cover. So I actually copied this example from an unrelated talk about TypeScript. But the main message I want to have for you is that publishing plugins to NPM can be really easy. And in particular, a lot of people think you might have to compile your JSX to JavaScript and have a build process for your plugin before you can publish it to NPM. But that's not true. All you need is your JSX file or your TSX file, and you can publish the untransformed source directly as is to NPM. So if you imagine that on the right is our plugin component, then all you need to do is add a package JSON file like this. Give your plugin a name. Again, this is from a different talk, so it's not a great example, but you'd probably want something like my company plugin 1 or whatever, and then give it a version. This is the new package JSON format. The old one uses main and module, but the new way to do it is to define exports and then a default export, and then say if this package is used by the import syntax, then it should get this file. And again, I'm using TypeScript here, but you should use just plain JSX. And it doesn't need to be, it can be just JSX. So you just have your one JSX file, your package JSON file like this. And if you want to specify some dependencies for your plugin, you can. I recommend not specifying any dependencies that are already specified by the MFE, because there's no point in doing that, and it's just going to create conflicts that you needlessly have to update in future versions. But if you're, say, using Paragon components and you really want to be future-proof, you can say, like, this works with this range of Paragon versions or something. Personally, I find it a big hassle to update these dependency lists a lot, so I just recommend either leaving it out or putting very vague ones like any version of Paragon, and then you won't have to keep updating this as a new version of Paragon comes out, which happens fairly often. But technically, the best practice would be to know the range of major versions that is compatible with your plugin and specify that. So I'll leave it to your judgment, but if you did have an additional dependency for your plugin, like Monsef I think was asking earlier, if you have some third-party package that is needed for your plugin, then specify that here as your dependencies in package JSON. But this is all you need. So you have your plugin JSX file, you have this package JSON, which can be just 10 lines of code, and then if you're logged into NPM, you just type npm publish, and that's it. Now your plugin is on NPM. It's that easy. You can set up CI to publish to NPM, and you should publish on GitHub as well. But just to get your package NPM installable, really you just need to create 10 lines of package JSON and run npm publish, and you're good to go. And yeah, that's it that I have for the slides. We'll just take questions and help out for the rest of the time we have.
Questions? Feedback?
I guess we already answered most of the questions.
We'll be deleting the VM again if you have something you want out of it. All the information that you need to recreate it is in the README or in the slides. But if you did something you want to keep, make sure to copy it out. Kyle, go ahead.
I know there are a few of us here who were like, when you mentioned the insert and modify operations, things that you were looking for feedback, how would you like that feedback?
Adolfo, what do you
A forum post, I think, is ideal for this. Because then we can link to it and discuss it there, and then it can become an ADR or an OAP or something.
But if that's too much activation energy for you and we're not going to get your feedback, then just go on Slack on Frontend Working Group and put it there. I'd rather get your feedback the wrong way than not get your feedback at all.
We've had some great forum discussions already around some of this stuff. And it's a pretty free discussion kind of thing. You can express your hatred or love, it doesn't matter. We'll get the information and process it accordingly. Felipe, go ahead.
Who is the maintainer for the Frontend Plugins Framework repository? And how much evolution do you expect to have in that repository in the next, say, release, I don't know, for Sumac?
So the current maintainer is Jason Wesson at 2U. But it's sort of, as usual, Axum is acting as a fallback. Like, if they don't get to it, we'll try and get to it, right? And you can bother us for that.
Also, with the OEP 65 work that's going on, I believe Frontend Plugin Framework is being pulled into our new consolidated front-end repo.
Yeah, sometime before Sumac, I don't know if in time for Sumac for all MFEs, we're going to unify front-end platform, build, plugin framework, maybe header, footer, all in a single repository. So that should simplify some things, right? But wait, what was your second question?
Yeah, how much evolution you expected, specifically now that you mentioned that they are unifying, and that's brilliant. Around the front-end plugin framework, how much evolution do you expect to have around the API definition and...
How much what?
Evolution.
Evolution. Not insignificant is the best. Like, as I said, this is V0. So we expect to improve the API. And that means that if you write a plugin now, you might have to adjust syntax maybe as soon as Sumac, right? Depending on what we decide. What I recommend is get involved. Like, follow the discussions, particularly you don't have to come to the meetings, but record all meetings, the front-end working group meetings, so you can keep tabs on that. There are wiki pages with summaries, you don't need to watch the whole video. And also the related discussions in the forum. And when OEPs and ADRs come out, that's also a good place to keep tabs. But yeah, we do expect some improvement and some changes around it in the next couple of releases in particular. Especially as a result of OEP 65 as well, which is going to, remember, make the MFE a plugin. So we're going to be messing with the API for that as well. Go ahead, Fanny.
I think that's related to my question, which is like, are you expecting changes both on the sort of like configuration, like the configuration side and the end config of how to install slots, or on the plugin slot object that is sort of the core class that you're building on top of, or both?
So in the object, in the slot itself, we expect to extend it, at least, right? There might be some, say, we unify insert and wrap, or what was, anyway, we might unify some of those.
I would call that the config side, though. Like, I would
Yeah.
expect the config format will evolve a little bit, but the core way that the plugin slots work and that new plugins are inserted, I wouldn't expect that to change a lot,
Right.
unless
So-
there's a very good reason.
So if you're willing to like go add plugin slots right now, those probably won't change. And also, the sooner you add them, the sooner they can get carried forward by the team improving the plugin slot.
Yeah.
Instead of you having to relearn that.
Yeah. So if the slot makes it in, the syntax might change, but the slot's going to be there, right? And the intention, this is not in an ADR yet, or OOP, but the intention is whenever we make changes to plugin slots, it goes through the proper deprecation process, right? It's very visible. There's a period for comments. We're going to do our best to try and not to pull the rug out from anybody. Yep. Oh yeah, we're over.
That's our time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.